You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This was kind of the opposite game of the win that Syracuse had against Boston College. If you remember that game, it was a triple overtime thriller inside the Dome where the Orange were the ones who gave up a 3 at the end of regulation. They blew it in regulation, and then they managed to win the game in triple overtime, if you recall. Virginia Tech essentially flipped the script. Now, before we get to the end of game sequence, I just want to say this. Syracuse basketball lost this game on defense. They did not play a lick of defense all afternoon, and they honestly have not played a lick of defense in 2 years, if we're being frank. But from this game alone, Virginia Tech shot 61% from the field and 42% from the three-point line. Virginia Tech, really, they are a middle-of-the-pack ACC team, and you made them look like Duke on offense in this one. Oh, by the way, Syracuse, Virginia Tech, they did not have their leading scorer in this one, Toby Lawal. He did not play. And yet still, I get it. It went to overtime. Virginia Tech scored 101 points. That is ridiculous. How about Jaden Schutt, the guard for Virginia Tech who had 20 points today? Well, he must be a really, really good player, right? Well, he's not a bad player, but heading into this game, he had 6 total points in his previous 4. Of course, today against Syracuse, he manages to drop 20. Just a pathetic effort on the defensive end for Syracuse, and that's why they lost this game ultimately to Virginia Tech. Now let's talk about the end of game and the critical plays. We can start off with the good, which is the fact that Syracuse, thanks to Jaquan Carlos of all people, hit a three-pointer to tie the game at 82 and send it to overtime. So let's set the scene here. The Orange are down 82-79 with 4.5 seconds left in regulation. And you could thank Virginia Tech for trying to give Syracuse a chance because they missed a couple of free throws down the stretch. So the door is open for the Orange. But at the same time, I'm watching this game and I'm just thinking to myself, in fact, I might have tweeted it out at LO_Syracuse, Virginia Tech should foul. You always foul up 3 late. There's 4.5 seconds left. Syracuse has an inbound play at their own baseline. You have to go the length of the court and hit a three-pointer. And Virginia Tech plays awful defense on the inbound. They let Jaquan Carlos take a 3 from the right wing, and credit to him, he makes it. But my goodness, Virginia Tech, that was awful late game situational awareness on the players, and also you got to blame the coaches. That was brutal from Virginia Tech. My goodness. Imagine if they had lost. Man, I don't think Virginia Tech fans would be so happy. So the game goes to overtime. And Jaquan Carlos hits an amazing shot, right? Except he gives it right back in overtime on the defensive end. And before I tell you this sequence, Adrian Autry's reaction, they showed it on the broadcast, and you could see how displeased he was at this play because it was terrible. Setting the scene for you all, Virginia Tech has the ball. They are up 90-89 with 2 minutes left in overtime. So it's a 1-point game. It's still anyone's game at this point. There's enough time on the clock. And Jaden Young for Virginia Tech, he has the ball, and he drives down the right alley. He forces a double team. And he kicks it out to the left wing to a wide open Ben Hammond, who drills a three-pointer to make it 93-89 Virginia Tech. That was with 1:36 left in overtime. What I didn't tell you is how bad the defense really was. See, when Jaden Young is driving down the right alley, he forces a double team, and Syracuse is actually in pretty good shape on defense. They got the man inside, locked up. They're doubling the player driving to the basket. And Jaquan Carlos, who's on the weak side, whose sole responsibility is to make sure that Ben Hammond is not left alone wide open for 3, For whatever reason, he decides to sink down to the paint. Again, for no reason. And Ben Hammond, who's a 47% three-point shooter, drills a three-pointer. Again, that makes it 93-89 Virginia Tech with 1:36 left. I highly suggest that when you are done watching and listening to this podcast, you go look up that play on YouTube. It was awful defense by Jaquan Carlos. So yeah, he hits the three to send it to send it to overtime, but then he just gives it right back because you let Ben Hammond, a 47% three-point shooter, all alone. And by the way, with Jaquan Carlos, that wasn't the first time in the game that he left Ben Hammond wide open for a three-pointer. It's a little bit of a different situation, and it was so early in the game. This was in the first half. And this three-pointer that Ben Hammond hit, the one that I'm going to describe to you now, only made it 12-9, and it was actually Syracuse ahead of Virginia Tech at that point. But Jaquan Carlos goes underneath a screen on Ben Hammond. And I tweeted it out. You cannot go underneath a screen on a player that shoots 47% from the three-point line. Let him go to the basket. Run him off the three-point line. Those were just two of the many terrible defensive lapses by Syracuse in this one. I'm sorry that two of them were Jaquan Carlos, the ones that I pointed out, but that three-pointer that Ben Hammond hit at the end of overtime was a huge one for Virginia Tech. I think that ultimately led them to win this game. And the one in regulation that I pointed out was to show that it wasn't the first time that Carlos left that guy wide open. You just can't do that.